Sabbath, everybody. Today is November 6, 2021. And we were not here last week. But 2 weeks ago, we kind of made a summary of line upon line about the sanctuary and the restoration of the sanctuary. And it took us more than a year to study about the sanctuary. Such an in-depth study, actually. There's so many things that we studied about the sanctuary, and that now we're going to go to a different subject about the destruction and the judgment upon the cities, and also the map's vision, the judgment upon the cities and the map's vision. All right. This has been done several times, but we're going to do it just because we do it according to our method of study, line upon line, right? So we have to look at the judgment of cities, even from the first city that was mentioned in the Bible. So the first mention of cities in the Bible is where we start, and we go line upon line because there's going to be judgment upon the cities in the end time. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. So we'll start with the cities. Where do we first see the first mention of a city in the Bible? Obviously, it's going to be in the book of Genesis. But what is the first city mentioned in the Bible? What is the first city mentioned in the Bible? You got to open up your Bible. Obviously, Genesis, right? What is the first city mentioned? And the first city, the first mention of anything in the Bible is very significant because the principle about what happens to the first mention of an entity or a situation that is mentioned in the Bible applies even to all the other mentions subsequently in the Bible, right? Yeah. So the first mention of the Bible in the Bible of a city, right, is in Genesis 10. Right? I have the picture here of the Middle East, right? And Genesis 10, verse 8 to 12. And Cush begat Nimrod. So Nimrod is the son of Cush. And the generation starts, you can think of it, it starts with Noah. And Noah had 3 sons. And one son is named Ham. And Ham has a son named Cush. And Cush begats Nimrod, right? So Nimrod is the 4th generation from Noah, right? Noah, Ham, Cush, and then Nimrod, right? And Nimrod was a mighty hunter, right? And what did he do? He built his kingdom, and his first city that he built was what? What was the first city? Babel. Babel is the first city mentioned in the Bible. That's very significant, right? And then Babel, and then Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. And out of that land went forth Ashur. Now Ashur is actually the son of Shem. So Noah, Shem, and Ashur. Okay? Ashur built Nineveh, Rehoboth, and Calath. And Rezin, which is in between Nineveh and Calah. So Ashur built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin. So Nimrod built 4 cities, right? Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. Ashur built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin, right? Yeah, the amazing thing is that Nimrod, the first city that he built was Babel. Ashur, the first city that he built was Nineveh. And these 2 cities were given warnings and judgments, right? Nineveh and Babel. So we'll study about Nineveh, and we also obviously will start with Babel. And the same is a great city, right? And Rezin was a great city, right? All these cities were great, right? But the first mention of the city that was built by Nimrod is Babel. And the first city that was built by Ashur is Nineveh. Okay. All right. All right. Well, we'll start with Babel then, right? The judgment on Babel, right? Babel or Babel? Babel, all right? God commanded them after the flood that they had to what? Did they have to stay in one place? No, they had to disperse throughout the land, right? They had to disperse throughout the land, but they did not follow God's commandment. Instead, they want to stay in one place, and what did they want to build? A city and a tower, all right? What does a city and a tower do? What is the symbol of a city and a tower? What a city and a tower is a symbol of what? Church and state, right? But this church and state is against the commandment of God to disperse. Instead, they gather together and want to build a church and state, the city and a tower, right? The city and tower, and God was not pleased, right? And if Babel is the state or the city, and the church, then what is the church or the religion? Okay, what's the religion of the people of Babel, or eventually called Babylon? What is their religion? What is their religion? And it's based on the builder. Who's the builder? Who's the builder? Nimrod, right? Who did the people of Babylon worship? Yeah, who is their God? No, they worship who did the people of Babylon eventually worship? They worship Nimrod, which is also called what? What's the other name for Nimrod? Baal. And who's the wife of Nimrod? His own mother. What's the name of his wife and his own mother? Semiramis. In the Bible, Semiramis is called who? Ashtoreth, right? And they had a son, and the son's name is who? Tammuz. So this city had a church, and that church had three gods: is Baal, Ashtoreth, and Tammuz. Wow. All right. Yeah. They did not heed the commandment of God to disperse. Instead, they made an unlawful church and state relationship. And they worshiped three gods: Baal, Ashtoreth, and Tammuz. Okay? Baal is mentioned many times in the Bible. Ashtoreth is mentioned a few times. How many times is Tammuz mentioned in the Bible? How many times? Only one time. Only one. Tammuz is only mentioned once. Where? In Ezekiel 8, right? In Ezekiel 8. All right. And that city is called Babel, because there the Lord had confounded the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad. So Babel means confounded, means confusion, right? So confusion and error. They did not follow the commandments of God, and they worshiped three gods: Baal, Ashtoreth, and Tammuz, right? And how was Babel, the city, the Tower of Babel, how was the Tower of Babel destroyed? Right, okay, this is a question. Now, we studied this before, but how was the Tower of Babel destroyed? Remember how the Tower of Babel destroyed? Yeah, people always say, okay, the Tower of Babel destroyed because they did not understand each other, and say they cannot build it because one was asking for a rock and somebody brought him a stick, because their language was confounded. But how was the Tower of Babel destroyed? What destroyed it? What brought it down? What was it that brought the Tower of Babel down? And this is why we need Ellen White, right? It was destroyed by a ball of fire from heaven. The first city was destroyed. Yeah? The tower in that city was destroyed by lightning from heaven as an evidence of God's displeasure for their sin, right? For their sin. For creating an unlawful church and state relationship, right? And not wanting to be scattered throughout the world, right? Yeah. So the first city was destroyed. The tower was destroyed by a lightning from heaven because of God's wrath, God's displeasure, because they did not want to be scattered. Right? Okay, right. So that's the first city. We won't go to Nineveh yet, but the lightning from heaven, the fire from heaven, right? So I became curious, where do we see the first time that in the Bible that fire came down from heaven? Where is the first time that fire came down from heaven in the Bible? Right? Okay, let's see. Where's the fire that came down from heaven? Where's the first time that fire came down from heaven? Okay, the story is right here. It doesn't say so in the Bible, but boy, it's so amazing that if we study the Bible and the spirit of prophecy together, there's a lot more things that we can glean out of our study, right? Because in the story of Cain and Abel, Abel decided to render true worship by sacrificing a lamb, right, out of his flock. But Cain, he did not want to render true worship, and he wanted to put his offering with the fruits of his field, right? Yeah. And which one was accepted by God? Right? Who God respected unto Abel and his offering. How did God respect unto Abel the offering of the lamb? How did God respect unto Abel? Fire flashed from heaven. All right, so when fire comes from heaven, what does it mean? This is going to mean there's going to be a time of judgment, right? Where there is an acceptance of true worship versus rejection of false worship. And after that, what happened between Cain and Abel? Cain persecuted and killed Abel. So after the fire comes down from heaven, separating true worshipers and false worshipers, what happens? There's going to be a time of persecution, right? Those who like Abel, who was persecuted but showed purity, refinement, and peace and love, right? But instead, Cain, under trial and affliction, he showed his carnal thoughts, lustful desire, selfishness, cunning, deceit, falsehood, enmity, and jealous. So under trial and tribulation, those who have not been molded into the character of Christ, instead will show their carnal thoughts, lustful desires, selfishness, cunning, deceit, falsehood, enmity, and jealousy. Right? See, this is what happens. Under trial and affliction, those who are like Abel will have peace, right? They will show purity, refinement, peace, and love, right? But those who have not been molded under the molding of Christ, when the time of judgment comes, then their character will show their true colors, right? They have not been molded. Okay, so this is what happens. We have to see that judgment comes with fire from heaven, right? And it separates the true worshiper from the false worshipers. And then comes persecution, all right? And then it shows the difference between the Cains and the Abels, right? Their character is shown, all right? Okay, now we see what happens during the flood. Now is the judgment upon the earth, right? The judgment upon the earth. In Patriarchs and Prophets. But upon the 8th day, dark clouds overspread the heavens. There followed mutterings of thunder and flash of lightnings. So before the rain started falling, what happens? There's thunder and lightning. There's fire from heaven. And then the rain starts coming down, right? The people first beheld the destruction of the works of their hands. So how were their works of their hands destroyed? Their buildings, their gardens and groves, where they had placed their idols, were destroyed by lightning from heaven. Their altars, which they had sacrificed the abominable human sacrifice, were destroyed, right, by the power of the living God. Okay? And then the waters came. So before the waters came, there was thunder and lightning. Okay? There was thunder and lightning. So that's, the judgments. We see these fires from heaven. Fires from heaven is also destroy the false worshippers and their idols and their altars. But the fire from heaven also is a sign of respect and acceptance for the true worshippers, right? Okay, now we go to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 19, verse 1 to 5. And there came 2 angels to Sodom, right? The 2 angels had come to Sodom. Before that, 2 angels had been before they went to Sodom, where were they? Before they went to Sodom, they met Abraham. With who? With Jesus. Jesus and the 2 angels had met Abraham. And Abraham was staying where? He was staying outside the city, right? He was living outside. He said, oh, you know what? You can have the valley and the cities. I'm going to stay in the pastures outside the city. And then Jesus and the 2 angels came and visited him. And he had to bargain. Oh, if possible, if there's 30 people, I can't remember. He had to keep going down by 5s, right? 30, 25, 20, 50, and then eventually get down to 5. If there's 5 people, or 10 people. Anyway, if there is enough people, will you still save Sodom and Gomorrah? And God said yes. But turns out there's only how many people? There's only 4. There's not enough people in there to be saved from the wrath. So Sodom and Gomorrah had to be destroyed. And how many angels were sent? Two angels. Why two angels? Why two angels? Right? Because it's the second angel's message. Come out of an apostate, confused church and state relationship, right? Come out of Babylon, right? So you do not receive the wrath of God, okay? That's the second angel's message, right? You have to come out of confusion. You have to come out of the false church and state union, right? So you do not receive the wrath of God. And physically, why two angels? Physically, because how many hands does angels have? Two hands, right? So two angels, there's four hands, enough to take out four people, right? Each angel will pull physically two people out, and they got four people out of Sodom, right? So physically, they had to pull Lot and his family out, right? And the story goes, and we remember the story, right? They had visited Abraham, and Abraham was living out in the countryside, right? And they had to bargain, right? They had to bargain, but there was not enough believers in Sodom, right? So the angels went down to the two angels went down to the city, and Lot met them at the gate, right? And then when they went into the house, what happened? Right? They went into the house, and the people cried out to Lot, "Where are the men which came into thee this night?" What? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. Wow. These Sodoms were Sodomites, right? To know them, they actually wanted to, they wanted to perform licentious acts with the angel. This is amazing, right? And that was one of their sins. And that's why, that's the root word for the word sodomy. This is incredible. You know, we already know this. And how many times were there a shut door? How many shut doors were there in the time of Lot? I mean, the time of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. There was two shut doors, right? The first time was when Lot had to separate his daughters. And he said, "Behold, I have two daughters, which have not known men." They have never known any men. You want to know these men? My daughters have not known any men. You can do anything with my daughters. And then he had to shut the door to protect his family and the two angels. And then when the people wanted to break down the door, the angels had to pull him in. And they opened the door and pulled him in. And then they shut the door to keep them out. Right? There was how many shut doors? There are two shut doors, right? What does that mean for us? How many times are there shut doors for us? 2 times, right? There's going to be the national and the universal shut door, right? Yeah. And what happened to the men that were outside who wanted to come in when the door was shut? They were smitten with blindness. They were groping in the dark, right? There's a darkness during that time of the shut door. Okay. This is why darkness is so important, right? Darkness is so important during the time of the shut door. Okay. They were groping in blindness. Yeah, they could not find the door. They were looking for the door, and they were blind. They can't see anything. They were in error, because error is darkness and light is truth, right? They were in error, right? The point is here. the darkness is associated with the shut door. Right? He had to shut the door. And then the angel said, do you have any family members that we can bring out? Because we are going to destroy this city. And Lot, what did Lot do? Right? We're going to destroy the city. Go and tell your rest of the family. And what did Lot do? He went and spake to his son-in-laws and who had married his daughters. So he had at least 2 daughters and at least 2 son-in-laws, right? And says, you better come because the Lord is going to destroy this city also. And what did they do? They mocked him, right? They mocked him. And when the morning arose, and you know what? When the morning arose, the angel actually, what did the angel have to do? They had to lay hold upon the hand of his wife, the hand of Lot, and the hand of his 2 daughters. That's why there's 2 angels, because both of them had to pull Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters by hand. Meaning, what does that mean? Is it a suggestion to come out of, it is a suggestion for them to come out of Sodom and Gomorrah? No. They actually have to be pulled out. It is not a suggestion, right? It's a command. They better believe it, and they better come out. As a matter of fact, they were physically pulled out by the angels, right? Oh, so they went out, and they were pulled out. The thing about it is, you know, when they were going out, as they had left the city, then the angel says, do not look back, right? Keep running away from the plains, because in the plains are the cities. The cities are in the plains. You have to run to the what? You have to escape to the mountain. And then Lot said, oh no, I'm going to die if I run to the mountain. Maybe he was trying to bargain. So just Abraham had to bargain with the Lord. You know, now Lot, he wanted to bargain with the angels, right? Oh, if I run to the mountains, I'm going to die. And it says, can't I go to just a small city? And it says, it's all right. Go to a small city. And what's the name of that small city? The little city? Zoar, right? And then, as the sun came up, fire and brimstone came down from heaven. And obviously, you know, only 3 made it. Only 3 made it safely out, because Lot's wife looked back because she loved her possessions, right? All right. So the point is, when the fire and brimstone comes, it's actually a time that you have to run to the caves yet? They did have to run to the caves afterwards. But first, they had to run to the small city, right? The small city of Zoar, right? When the fire and brimstone came out, and the 2 angels had to bring them out of confusion and error, out of the false church and state union, right? And they had to be physically pulled out, right? Okay. Had to be pulled out. All right? Second Peter 2, verse 6. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them a what? Making them an ensample unto those that after should live ungodly. So Sodom and Gomorrah is an ensample, is a shadow of what the real thing is going to happen. Because if they're a shadow, then what is going to happen in our time? in the cities of the plain in our time will be the real thing. The flames that consume the cities of the plain shed their warning light down even to our time. We are taught the fearful and solemn lessons that while God's mercy bears long with the transgressor, there is a limit beyond which men may not go on in sin. When that limit is reached, then the offers of mercy are withdrawn and the ministration of judgment begins. Wow. That's not as bad as the greater sin, right? There's a greater sin that was committed by those who dwelled in Sodom and Gomorrah. The Redeemer of the world declares that there are greater sins than that for which Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. Right? Those who hear the gospel invitation called sinners to repentance and heed it not are more guilty, right, before God than were the dwellers in the vale of Shittim. And still greater sin is theirs who profess to know God and to keep His commandments, yet who deny Christ in their character and their daily life. In the light of the Savior's warning, the fate of Sodom is a solemn admonition, not merely to those who are guilty of outbreaking sin, but all who are trifling with heaven-sent light and privileges. Right? Heaven-sent light and privileges. Remember that the angels actually warned Lot's other children? No. Who warned Lot's other children? It was Lot, right? The angel said to Lot, okay, call your other children. Yeah, as if to say, call your other children. So Lot went and called the other children. He said, this city is going to be destroyed. The other children and the sons-in-laws. But who had a greater sin? The people of Sodom and Gomorrah or the family of Lot? The family of Lot had a greater sin because they knew, but they trifled with heaven-sent light and privileges. They actually mocked, right? They mocked Lot. Yeah. At the time of Lot's removal to Sodom, corruption had not become universal, and God in His mercy permitted rays of light to shine amid the moral darkness. When did Sodom and Gomorrah get warned? When did Sodom and Gomorrah get warned? Because when the angels came, the angels told Lot, okay, Lot, get your family. When the two angels went down and warned Lot, the city of Sodom and Gomorrah itself and the rest of the inhabitants were not warned. When were they warned? Right? When Abraham rescued the captives from the Elamites, the attention of the people was called to the true faith. Remember Abraham? He was called and say, oh, you know what? Your family Lot has been kidnapped. He's been kidnapped by the king of the Elamites, right? Because the king of the Elamites had been warring against Sodom and Gomorrah. The Elamites have now conquered Sodom and Gomorrah and now taken Lot captive. So, come and join us and fight against the Elamites, right? So we can rescue Lot, right? Abraham was not a stranger to the people of Sodom, and his worship of the unseen God had been a matter of ridicule among them. But his victory had over greatly superior forces, and his magnanimous disposition of the prisoners and spoil excited wonder and admiration. While his skill and valor were extolled, none could avoid the conviction that the divine power had made him conqueror. And his noble and unselfish spirit, so foreign to the self-seeking inhabitants of Sodom, was another evidence of the superiority of the religion which he had honored by his courage and fidelity. So when he helped save Lot and his family, his act of courage became a witness to the people in that valley, right? In Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The thing about it is, right? This is so amazing. The story is so amazing, actually, because At that time, it was the Amorites that had called Abraham. Hey, come and join us to save us from the Elamites, right? And also so that you can also save Lot. It was the Amorites. So the Amorites already during the time of Abraham had heard about the true God. Right? So Sodom and Gomorrah, their judgment ended when the fire and brimstone came from heaven. Right? Sodom and Gomorrah. What about the Amorites? When did their judgment come? When was the judgment to the Amorites finished? When was their probation to the Amorites finished? Genesis 15. Right? But in the fourth generation, shall the Genesis 15 verse 13 to 16. You just read. The Hebrews went out of Egypt. But they cannot enter Canaan until what? Until the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites are not yet full. The Amorites, probation closed, right? After their fourth generation. And their fourth generation, since they had learned from Abraham about what? About the true God, but they still lived in iniquity. And they had to finish 4 generations before God's people can enter Canaan and then destroy the Amorites, because they have to kill all the ites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, all the ites had to be all killed. But they had to be killed when? After their fourth generation. Since when? Since Abraham told them about their true God, right? The Canaanites knew about the God of Abraham, but they were given probation for 4 generations. Only after that 4th generation can God's people then enter into Canaan. So Sodom and Gomorrah had their close of probation, and they received the fire and brimstone from heaven. The Amorites also received their close of probation after their 4th generation, right? And then the Israelites then can call and can destroy them all, and now inhabit the land of Canaan, right? So all these people and nations have to have their time of probation. When they do not pass their time of probation, then they will have to receive their judgment, right? The stir of active life began in the streets. Men were doing their various ways, intent on the business of pleasure of the day. The sons-in-law of Lot were making merry at the fears and warnings of the weak-minded old man. Wow, they mocked him. Suddenly and unexpectedly, as would be a thunder peal from an unclouded sky, the tempest broke. The Lord rained brimstone and fire out of heaven upon the cities and the fruitful plain. Right? And the fair vale of Sodom became a desolation, a place never to be built up or inhabited, a witness to all generations of the certainty of God's judgment upon transgression. It is an ensample, right? Not only for the people who do not fear God, but also the people who proclaim that they fear God, who know the messages to come out of error, confusion, to come out of Sodom and Gomorrah, to come out of the cities, right? But they trifled with heaven-sent, right? Heaven-sent messages and privileges. They have a greater sin, right? And it is a witness, because these things happen to them as an ensample, what? For us, right? Okay. So now we go to Nineveh, right? So we had Babel, and then we had We also had Sodom. And then now we go to Nineveh, right? So Jonah was in the belly of the whale for how long? 3 days, and he was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, right? 3 days and 3 nights. And he rose and went to Nineveh, right? Nineveh was a great city of 3 days journey. To travel there, you take 3 days, and obviously you travel during the day, and the night you rest, and it takes 3 days to get there, right? And Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, and he cried and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." So he walked, and it's 3 days, and he rested at night, and he entered another day. So when you count it, it's like 3.5 days before he was able to give his warning. And his warning says, "In 40 days shall your city receive the wrath of God," right? And the thing about it is, Nineveh was warned way after Lot, the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. So we can see here it has already been a precedence that during the time of Lot, Lot only called God's people out, right? So the first city, right? The first city that the message was sent by God's people to warn that city, it was only given to God's people that was in that city. But by the second time, then the next city that was warned by God's people, in this case was Jonah, it was not only given to the people, but also given to the king, right? So the king and the people were given the messages. And what did they do? They all repented, right? They all repented. Okay. And remember at that time, Jonah, he says, "Okay, I'm going to watch as this city is going to be destroyed by God." And what did he do? He sat outside the city. And wow, it's hot. And during that city, and God gave him a what? A gourd, right? And this gourd is a gourd. It's like a gourd is like a pumpkin, right? I guess a pumpkin. And that gourd grew a vine, right? And so he could sit under the vine so that he would be in a shade as he was waiting for the judgment that come down on Nineveh. But then what happened? Then came a worm. And the worm ate the gourd, that vine. So what happened? So Jonah was basking there in the sun and had a heat stroke. He fainted. And he says, he was waiting, he did not feel sorry for God, for the people of Nineveh. He said, "You know what? God said you are all going to be destroyed, right? Instead, you're not destroyed. And now the vine is destroyed. Oh my, poor vine. The vine is destroyed, and poor me. I'm also sick from a heat stroke." And God said, "What? And you're worried about that vine? I'm actually worried about the 600,000 people in Nineveh who do not know their right hand from their left hand, and they were all saved," right? So God says, "Oh, Jonah, you worried about the gourd, and you worry about yourself. But God says, I worry more about the people of Nineveh that were spared because they had repented." Right? And this became a lesson because when Jesus came, the people gathered thick around together and said, "This is an evil generation." And he said, "This is an evil generation. They seek a sign, and there shall no sign be given it, but the sign of Jonas the prophet." What does Jonah mean? What does Jonah mean? Jonah means a dove, right? The sign of the dove. For as Jonah was the sign unto the Ninevites, so shall the Son of Man be to this generation. So Jesus received the dove where? At his baptism. And during that time, it was the beginning of his 3.5 year ministry, right? Yeah. Because he had to give them a warning that within this generation, you will not see your temple stone one on top of the other. This temple and this city will be destroyed, right? But then they captured him and they put him in the belly of the earth, right? From the time of Gethsemane, Satan and his followers were in control of Jesus for what? 3 days and 3 nights. He was in the belly of the earth. He was in the control of the followers of Satan, right? Until he was spewed out of the earth like Jonah was spewed out of the belly of the whale, right? See, the sign of Jonas is the sign of the Son of Man, right? What happened to Jonas is like the warnings that Jonas gave to the Ninevites, but actually was the messages of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus during that time, giving a warning to Jerusalem, right? Going to Jerusalem. But the Ninevites will eventually one day judge the Jews, right? Because the Ninevites repented, but the Jews did not. This is amazing, right? Yeah. Now we go to Egypt, right? All right, Egypt. Wow. To go to Egypt, we have to see that who was the first prophet that was sent to Egypt, right? Who was the first prophet? Well, Abraham and also Isaac went to Egypt. But also, we know Joseph. Joseph was a prophet that was sent, right? Because he had to interpret dreams, right? He had to interpret dreams for Pharaoh. And this Pharaoh, right, had a dream. And he saw that there were seven cows, right? And was eaten by the 7 sickly, withered cows were eaten by 7 fat cows. And this dream had to be interpreted by Joseph, right? And he interpreted that there was going to be a famine, right? And the 7 cows and the 7 ears of corn were withered because it was blasted by what? By the east wind. So the famine comes because of the east wind. And the judgments of God comes because of famine, right? Judgment comes because of fire from heaven, but judgment also comes because of famine. And famine comes with the east wind, right? That comes with the east wind, right? And this interpretation was given by Joseph to the Pharaoh. And because of this, Joseph was given the title of prime minister. And then he gathered corn for his family, right? But during the time of Moses, right? Before we jump to Moses, right? Joseph had to gather all the corn in Egypt, and he had to store it in the storehouses. And then all the people were able to buy corn with what? With their money. But then the money failed because the money all ran out. And when they ran out of money, because the money failed, what did they buy corn with? No, they had to buy it with their cattle, right? They had to, okay, here we give you our cattle, right? And when the cattle, cattle is what? Cattle is their livelihood, right? The cattle is their livelihood. Money fails, and then their livelihood fails. And after they ran out of their cattle, what did they have to do? Okay, and that now we will give you our land, now their dwelling places. They have to give their land to Joseph for food. And after they ran out of land, what did they have to do? They had to sell themselves as slaves, right? To work for Pharaoh. And then they were all moved to the cities, except for the priest who owned land, right? And God's people who lived in Goshen. They did not have to go to the cities, right? Those people, this story is so is an example of what's going to happen at the end time. Because first, money fails, and then your cattle fails, your livelihood fails, and then your land, which is your houses and your possessions, fail, right? And then you have to be sold as slaves and move to the cities. And then Joseph gives a law. Joseph makes a law that every man have to plant their seed, and a fifth of all their proceeds have to be given to Pharaoh. So the law comes way after the money fails, right? The law that you have become slaves to Pharaoh and you have to work for Pharaoh, right, comes after the money fails, after your livelihood fails, after your land and your possessions fail, and then you become slaves. And then comes the law, right? Yeah. So we see this is going to happen in our time. Money fails not after the Sunday law, but money fail much sooner, right? It shows that the Sunday law is about to come when money first fails, and then your livelihood fails, no more work, and then no more house, and then you become slaves to the government, and you have to then you are brought to live in the cities, right? All right. But then now we can jump over to the story of Moses, because during this time there's a new Pharaoh, and this new Pharaoh does not know the story of Joseph and the old Pharaoh, right? And this new Pharaoh was the one that had been enslaving God's people, right? And Moses and Aaron was sent to go to that Pharaoh and ask them to let God's people go and what? And worship. Where? Where are they asked to worship? Go and worship in the wilderness for 3 days. Go and worship in the wilderness for 3 days. And Pharaoh said, what? You don't have enough work? And you want to go and worship? Instead of worshiping your God, I'm going to make you even more work. You have to, instead of straw being applied for you, straw being given to you, now you have to work. Instead of worshiping your God, now you have to work and gather your own straw to make bricks, right? Yeah. So there is a Pharaoh that does not know God. He's the type of a king of the south. He's the type of the king of the south. He does not know God, and he's gonna make God's people what? He's gonna make God's people work. When they're supposed to have a day of rest, he's gonna make them work. What is that? That's a Sunday law, right? Right. That's it's going to be a Sunday law, because instead of resting, going to the wilderness and worshiping, they have to work for more straw, right? And they were in bondage. They were in bondage during that time, right? So that now Moses says, now because of this, right? Because Pharaoh's heart is hardened by the Lord, right? The Lord let it happen, that Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Now he will multiply the signs and wonders on the land of Egypt, which are the judgments on Egypt, right? The signs and wonders upon Egypt are the plagues. Obviously, we know these plagues, right? First, there was the sign that was given by Aaron, right? And then the snake ate up all the snakes of the magicians. And then comes the plagues: blood, frogs, and then lice. Then after that, swarms, and then diseases of the cattle and boils, right? That's number 6. What's number 7? Fire and hail, right? Fire and hail destroyed what? All the crops, right? And what is left from the crops were eaten up by locusts. And where did the locusts come from? The locusts came from the east, brought in by the east wind. And then after that, there were darkness. And then the sword came. The sword came, and the 10th plague was given, and all the firstborn died. And Pharaoh, and there was a great cry in Egypt, right? And remember, there is the finger of God. When the Egyptians realized that the 3rd plague was a finger of God. Why? They could not replicate it. They could not replicate that finger of God, the 3rd plague. After that, the rest of the 7 last plagues of the 10 plagues did not hit upon Goshen, right? Did not hit upon Goshen. Now we did this a long time ago, but it's worth reviewing again. Because in Deuteronomy 28, the plagues are repeated, except the sequence is a little bit different, right? The plagues of Egypt are repeated, and the first one that was said was, I will give you, because you do not follow the judgments and the statutes of God, I will send you the bear. The bear is the diseases of Egypt upon the cattle. As the animal diseases, you are going to get animal diseases, right? And after that, you're going to get sores. But according to Deuteronomy 28, the next plague is actually darkness, right? And after that, we will see it's like, same like in Egypt, right? It's like hail and fire. Hail and fire is another nation coming down, like hail and fire. And after that, it's going to be locusts. And then a nation that is like that has the beast, that's like a teeth, like a beast, is going to come and siege your city, right? And all your sons and daughters, you have to eat your sons and daughters, right? This is going to happen because there's a big famine and you have to eat your sons and daughters. It's like your sons and daughters have to die. In Egypt, the sons and the firstborn have to die. Here, you have to eat your sons and daughters. The sequence is a little different because the darkness happens here. The darkness happens here, and this one happens here. So if you put 2 lines upon each other, Exodus and Deuteronomy, you see that there's 2 darknesses. What's the significance of these 2 darknesses? before the final last plague, the final last judgment, right? Two darknesses. Remember, we can see that before Jesus comes, there's two institutions that have to be restored, right? The two institutions that have been trampled under law, underfoot. What are the two institutions that came out of Egypt? They came out of Eden. That has to be restored. It's the marriage and Sabbath. So if the two institutions are the laws of protection, they're the light, they're the truth. The opposite of it is darkness. So there's going to be a false marriage and a false Sabbath, right? The false marriage is the marriage of what? Of church and state. Remember, there's church. Babel is a false marriage of church and state. There's going to be a false marriage of church and state. And there's a false Sabbath, right? That's the two darknesses that happens before the last plague, right? See, this is darkness here. This is darkness. So that's why if we put this together, you see that there's darkness here and there's darkness here. Now this sequence is a little different because here the darkness is over here. Instead of being here, it's here.
So what is to replace?
It's not replaced by anything. But when we line it up together, then we say, wait a minute. If you line it together, there are darknesses. There's darkness here and darkness here. I know, there's only 6. But when you line it together, then you see the sequence shows that there's 2 darknesses when you line this up together. Okay? Because in Matthew 24, Mark and Luke, Jesus said, these are the beginning of sorrows. What are the beginning of sorrows? There's going to be pestilence. What are the pestilence? The diseases. The diseases. These are the diseases. What else? There's going to be famine. What's the famine? The hail and the fire is going to hit all your crops. And then the rest of your crops are going to be eaten by locusts. There's not going to be any food. Here's going to be famine. And then what's the other thing? Pestilence, famine, and nations will fight against nations. There's going to be the sword, right? The 10th plague is the sword, right? And there are going to be earthquakes in diverse places. What's earthquake? That's the actual earth shaking. But Ellen White said, earth does not only mean the earth itself, but also means the powers of the earth that are shaken. Right? What are the powers of Egypt that are shaken? It's Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh is shaken because he sees that the pestilence have come and the famine has come and then the sword has come and now the powers of the earth are shaken, right? The powers of the earth are shaken, right? These things all line up together. And it all happens between the time of the 2 darkness, the darkness of the image of the beast test and the image to the beast test. We see all these things happen, right? All these things happen, right? Wow, right. Now we go to Daniel. Daniel 5. This is the judgment upon Babylon, right? In the same hour, there was the finger of a man's hand, right? Remember the Egyptians, they recognized the finger of God, and that's the 3rd plague. Now there's a finger of God that had written on the walls, right? And on the walls, and what did that do? Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him. Then the powers of the nation was shaken. Right? This is the earthquake. Right? His countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him. That the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against the other. That's the earthquake. That's the powers of the earth quaking, the shaking, right? Yeah, because of the finger of God, right? Yeah, because the wise men and the astrologers, they cannot understand the writing, but it was only Daniel that can make an interpretation, right? Interpretation, right? Of what was written by the fingers of God. And it's mene tekel upharsin. Their kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And where did the Medes and the Persians come? They come from the east. Medo-Persia, Medes and the Persians come from the east of Babylon, right? They come from the east. Okay. Revelation 16 verse 12. And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water was dried up. And the way of the kings of the east must be prepared. So Medes and the Persians come from the east of Babylon, and they attacked Babylon when Euphrates was dried up. Right? The kings of the east, Medes and the Persians. Okay, and Jesus said, remember, not only in Matthew 24, that the beginning of sorrows, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when you read, there's the beginning of sorrows, which is the sword, famine, pestilence, and earthquake in diverse places. And these are the beginning of sorrows. But Jesus also said, there shall not be left one stone upon another, and it shall be thrown down. And his disciples, four of them, asked them, what is the when will this happen? When will the temple be destroyed? And when shall the sign of the coming and the end of the world be? And Jesus said, the answer is one, because the same thing will happen in this generation, before the end of this generation, and in the end of the world. Now learn of the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, know ye that the summer is nigh. Right? Right. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Right? Then there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. But as the days of Noah were, so also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Right? Because this was showing the destruction of Jerusalem. Right? Was this the only time that the destruction of Jerusalem was predicted? Right? When was another time that the destruction of Jerusalem was predicted? But this time is a little different, because it's not the destruction of Jerusalem was predicted during the time of... Jesus gave the prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem during the Roman siege. Who gave the prediction of destruction of Jerusalem during the Babylonian siege? Who gave that prediction? Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel gave that prediction. The Babylonians will siege it at the end of what? 300 days lying on your right side and 40 days lying on your other side, right? Right. 1 day for 1 year, right? 390 days for who? For the 10 lost tribes. And when did that happen? When Jeroboam built what? Built the 2 golden calves, and he served God on altars that was built in the north, right? And then it had to be thrown down by the king that came from the south. What was his name? That thrown down the altars of Jeroboam. It was the king called Josiah. And Josiah rebuilt the sanctuary. And he was, and the Jews, the two southern tribes, Judah, was given a probation of 40 years, right? So the 10 lost tribes in the north was given 390 years until Jerusalem will be sieged. And the southern tribes, the two southern tribes, were given 40 years until the siege of the city, right? So we know the city of Jerusalem was sieged, right? The siege of Jerusalem, right? Right? Why is this important? Because the Jerusalem was sieged during the time of Babylon and during the time of Rome. So we can put this all onto lines, right? This was during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, during the time of Babylon, right down here. And this is during the time of the Romans. This is during the Roman siege. How many sieges were there? 2 sieges, right? 2 sieges. The first siege here and the second siege here. During the time of Nebuchadnezzar, there was a siege and there was another siege right here. Okay? Let's go over the time. Let's see, where did I start first? All right. The 390 days and the 40 years end with the beginning of the first siege, right? The 390 days for the 10 tribes of the north, and the 40 days for the southern tribe. And then there will be the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, right? The thing about it is, Zedekiah, he made an alliance with Pharaoh. So Pharaoh came and helped Judah, right? And because of that, because Pharaoh came and helped Judah, what happened to the siege? The siege, they backed off the siege. So the Babylonians backed off, right? They no longer sieged that city, right? Because what? Because Pharaoh had come, right? But the problem is that Zedekiah, he also, at that time, he also promised that he was going to let all the slaves go. Because it was the first day of the 7th month. On the first day of the 7th month, that's the end of your Shemitah. And that's the time of Shemitah, and when you have to release all your slaves, because they have to have a Sabbath rest, right? So Zedekiah, who professed to be, the follower of God, broke the Sabbath rest. The Sabbath rest says you have to let your slaves free. Because why? You were slaves in Egypt, and the Sabbath is a memorial of the release of you being released from slavery. Sabbath is a memorial not of only of God's creation, but a memorial of your release of slavery. It's your release of working for 6 days. It's your release from bondage of sin, right? So that's why you have to release your slaves every 7 years. And what happened here? Zedekiah, he broke this Sabbath rest. And then eventually Pharaoh was broken. And then the siege started again, right? The siege started. So the siege started here, it was broken, and then because it was broken because Pharaoh came, and then Pharaoh eventually was broken. And the siege started again. But this time, Nebuzaradan was the son was one of the generals of Nebuchadnezzar, came and destroyed the cities and the gates, and eventually the temple was burned, right? So we see this because there's a time here. There's 18 months. People were given a period of time where they can recognize these things that are happening, right? They have to see that the siege was broken because the Egyptians came. And what are the Egyptians is also a symbol of what? The descendants of Hagar. Egyptians are descendants of Hagar, the Egyptians, right? And the descendants of Hagar is also Islam, right? And God's people who profess God's law here decided that they are going to break the Sabbath rest, right? So these are the signs that you have to recognize, because this is the time when you can escape. And the time of escape is not just like 1 hour or something like that. It's 18 months. In other words, it's not a very, very short, minute period. All right? It's going to be a time where you can recognize these things happen. You have to recognize that Pharaoh is coming. They'll break the siege, and there's going to be professed God's people who profess to be God's followers are going to break the Sabbath rest, right? And then after that, the siege will start again. But when this siege starts again, nobody can escape, right? That happens during the time of Cestius, because Cestius came during the time of the Feast of Tabernacle, right? During the Feast of Tabernacle. And Feast of Tabernacle, and then Titus came. The thing about it is, at this time, they did not realize why did Cestius back off? Why did the siege stop? Right? But when you put the two lines together, for us, we know the siege stops because of Pharaoh coming, and then also a breaking of the Sabbath rest. And this is all a sign for the people of Judah. They had 18 months before the two sieges. For here is 1260 days. It's 3.5 years, right? 3.5 years between the Feast of Tabernacle in 66 AD and Passover in 70 AD. There's 3.5 years, right? They have to recognize that's the time that they have to already leave the cities, right? You have to run to the mountains. You have to recognize, right? It is not a suggestion. Lot was pulled out by the hand of the angels. It is a commandment to leave, right? It is a commandment to leave. But you have to recognize these things, right? You have to recognize the events of what is happening. But remember, we don't want to be Lots in Sodom and Gomorrah. We want to live like Abraham and Sarah where? Not in the plains, but they were living in the hills, right? They were living outside, right? During the time of Pharaoh in Egypt, right? It was those who were living in Goshen who did not get the 7 last plagues of the 10 plagues, right? So these things we have to study because it is an example for us. We have to understand what is going to happen, right? All right. There's going to be, studying these 2 sieges, we realize what is going to happen, such that those who are still in the cities have to escape before finally there's no more escape. And all of God's people were saved. None of them were destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem, because they all had run to beyond Jordan to a city called to a small city beyond Jordan, which is called Bela, right? And which is beyond Jordan. Because Lot, he had escaped being dragged out by the two angels. And he went not into the cave yet, but he went to a small city called Zoar, right? So all these things are written for our admonition. This time of the last the time of the last generation will end at the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. All right? Okay. So that is our study for today. Hopefully, this is we can see the introduction of what happens to the cities, because then the next time we get around, we will study the vision of Ellen White about the balls of fire. We also study about the visions of the earthquake, the map vision, and the visions that shows that what is happening with the wrath of God that comes down upon the cities. So we will see that and compare that with the lines of all the cities that was warned in the Bible, and these things are written for us as an example, right? So that we won't be scared, right? But we will lose faith. But because of learning all these things, our faith will be increased, and we will have the hope that we will be saved during the time of judgment, right? And that is a more sure word of prophet.